I wanted to talk about people behaving badly. Very, very simple, straightforward process, a very simple hypothesis that starts out with the war on drugs. Back in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was pumping the war on drugs as hard as he could, because, you know, as we all know, John Ehrlichman back in the 60s said, well, actually, he said it in the 90s before he died when he was interviewed, but back in he was referring to 1968, and he said, you know, the two enemies that the Nixon administration had were black people and anti-war hippies. And we couldn't declare war on being black or being against the war or being a hippie. So and as I pointed out last week, at that point in time, more people died from falling down stairs or choking on food, not or choking on food. More people died from those things than died from illegal drugs in the United States in 1968. We did not have a drug problem. Yeah, there were a lot of hippies smoking pot, and people were, you know, experimenting with LSD, but they weren't dying. You don't die from those things. And so in any case, Ehrlichman said, so we criminalized marijuana, we criminalized heroin, and we could then use that to disrupt black communities and the anti-war community. And Reagan, of course, took that even bigger. And you'll recall this ad that the Partnership for Drug-Free America ran in 1968. And in this advertisement, they showed this study where this rat is all alone in a cage, and he's got two water bottles, and one has heroin in it, and one has just water in it. And the rat just keeps going to the heroin one until he finally dies. Another cage, rat has cocaine, he just keeps using it until he dies. Heroin and cocaine can both kill you if used to, you know, inappropriately in excess. And the ad said, and I quote, "Only one drug is so addictive, 9 out of 10 laboratory rats will use it and use it and use it until dead. It's called cocaine, and it can do the same thing to you." So we all came to believe that the problem of addiction that we had in the United States was caused by the presence of drugs, which is kind of interesting because cocaine and well, not heroin, but opium and opium salts were, you know, things close to heroin, were available at, you know, in any drugstore without a prescription in this country from the 1600s until the 1930s. Heroin was sold as an over-the-counter cough medicine for children in the 19-teens. It was a brand name of Bayer. But anyhow, because of this, we all came to the conclusion that drugs cause drug addiction. And then this professor of psychology in Vancouver, his name was Bruce Alexander, he looked at the study and he thought, that rat's all alone in that cage. If I was all alone in a cage, I might be inclined to take the heroin until I died too. I mean, it's solitary confinement, right? And so he built this rat park where rats had toys and plenty of room, and it was like a happy place for rats. Disney World for rats. And he put a water bottle there, and next to it he put a water bottle filled with water and cocaine. And guess what? I'm quoting an article here. This is, by the way, from, there's a new book called Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs by Jonathan Hari, H-A-R-I. And Jonathan Hari writes, the rats with good lives didn't like the drugged water. They mostly shunned it, consuming less than a quarter of the drugs the isolated rats used. None of them died. So then he said, you know, do we have a way of testing this on humans? And he says, yes, the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, 20% of American soldiers who went to Vietnam became addicted to heroin or were regularly using heroin. And there was this giant, and this is according to a study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry. And there was this generalized panic going on when the Vietnam War ended in, what, 73, I think, that we were going to have this flood of heroin addicts coming back to the United States. Well, what happened was all these GIs came back who had been addicted to heroin in Vietnam, in that hellhole, came back to the United States, reintegrated with their families and their communities. No addiction. So what the hell's going on? Everybody thinks it's the drugs. So Professor Alexander, he said, okay, let's try it even harder on these rats. So he took the rats and he let them use heroin and cocaine, different rats, different drugs, for 57 days. Now, this is the equivalent of several years in a human being's lifespan. So they were absolutely as addicted as you can get. 57 days, nonstop, continuous daily heroin usage in their little cage. Now, they didn't give them enough to kill themselves, but gave them enough to be addicted. And put them back, and then he took them out of there, and they always preferred the heroin to the water. Took them out of there, put them in the rat park, and guess what? Well, to quote from the book, the rats seemed to have a few twitches of withdrawal, but they soon stopped their heavy use and went back to having a normal life. The good cage saved them. He writes, Professor Peter Cohen argues that human beings have a deep need to bond and form connections. And this is where I'm going with this. I think that this is a variation on the book that was a New York Times bestseller back in the 90s, Bowling Alone. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the title of the author's name, rather. But the book was Bowling Alone, and it was about how we are isolating ourselves from each other. That we no longer have 5, 10, 15-year-long, close friendships. We no longer have communities. We're staring at our screens all the time. We're watching television at home. Families don't even talk to each other. Professor Peter Cohen argues that human beings have a deep need to bond and form connections. It's how we get our satisfaction. If we can't connect with each other, we will connect with anything we can find, the whir of a roulette wheel or the prick of a syringe. He says we should stop talking about addiction altogether and instead talk about our crisis of bonding. A heroin addict has bonded with heroin because she couldn't bond as fully with anything else. So the opposite of addiction, he writes, is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is human connection. Now, why am I bringing this up? And by the way, I've got a whole lot more information on this. Nearly 15 years ago, Portugal had the worst drug problem in Europe. 1% of their entire population was addicted to heroin. They tried the drug war and it didn't work. So what did they do? They legalized heroin. Anybody can get it anytime, anywhere, no problem. And guess what happened? Oh, and they provided heroin addicts with secure housing and subsidized jobs. So now something to get out of bed for. So now they're reconnected with their community. And he writes, I watched as they are helped in warm and welcoming clinics to learn how to reconnect with their feelings after years of trauma and stunning them into silence with drugs. Since decriminalization, addiction has fallen. Injecting drug use is down 50%. The main campaigner against decriminalization in 2000 was a politician by the name of João Figueiredo, the country's top drug cop. He now is out there advocating for total decriminalization. Now, where I'm going with this is that as we feel disconnected, we turn to dysfunctional behaviors. In this case, the dysfunctional behavior was drug addiction. For some people, it's sex addiction. For some people, it's gambling addiction. For some people, it's violence. For some people, it's crime. But in my opinion, the logical leap I'm making here is that if you isolate a group of people, in this case, to some extent, in many communities, it's African Americans. But it's also, Donald Trump wants to isolate Latinos, right? You isolate a group of people, you crap on them, you treat them badly, you deny them opportunities, you make their life hell. You should not be surprised if they start exhibiting behaviors that would be problematic, shall we say. So the simple solution, it turns out, to our problems is, hold it.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
For us to work together to reconnect people, to build social structures that include everybody, and to provide a social safety net that makes everybody feel safe.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.